The first tractor disappeared before daylight. No auction listing, no sign at the gate, no neighbor stopping by to lean on the fence and ask what kind of deal had been made. Just a lowboy trailer rolling into the yard at 5:40 in the morning, lights dimmed under a wet March sky, and a green row-crop tractor creeping up the ramps while Evan Marlowe stood beside the shop door with his hands in his coat pockets. By noon, a red tractor was backed into the same bay. Evan believed the switch had been quiet. By the time he was finished, 7 pieces of green equipment had left his farm in 19 months. One machine at a time. Different buyers, different counties. No big trade-in day. No public conversation. He thought he was managing the change carefully. He thought a machine parked inside his own equipment shed was nobody's business but his. That was the mistake. Because in a farming county, the color inside a shed is not just paint. It is a public notice, even when nobody files it. And Evan did not understand who would read that notice first. Evan Marlowe farmed 1,240 acres in north-central Tennessee, a mixed operation of dark-fired tobacco, corn, and soybeans. The tobacco ground sat low along the creek, heavy and black after rain, the kind of soil that made money when it was treated right, and punished a man when it was rushed. The grain acres spread higher, across rolling fields his father had tiled in the late 1970s, when corn prices made every hard decision feel a little less dangerous. Evan had inherited the farm's habits before he inherited the farm. His grandfather had run green equipment. His father had run green equipment. Evan ran green equipment, too. Not because he had tested every brand against every acre, but because some decisions arrive before a man is old enough to question them, and because Halstead equipment was only 12 miles from his driveway. The Halstead dealership had been there longer than most of the newer houses on the county road. Its owner, Warren Halstead, was 66 and knew the farms around Claiborne County with the quiet accuracy of a courthouse map. He knew who had paid cash for a grain cart and who had stretched the note to 5 years. He knew which sons were coming home to farm and which ones were only coming home for holidays. He knew which acres had good drainage, which families were land-rich and cash-poor, and which men were expanding with confidence they had not earned yet. Warren did not need a database to know the county. He had spent 4 decades selling equipment to the people who kept it running. Evan and Warren were not close friends, but they had a relationship. They had sat across from each other in the dealership office, working out numbers for planters, tractors, service packages, and used equipment values. When Evan's mother died, Warren came to the visitation and stood in line for almost an hour. When a hydraulic pump failed during tobacco setting season, Halstead equipment had a mechanic in Evan's field before dark. That kind of history is hard to price. It is also hard to leave. Evan did not decide to leave because he hated Warren Halstead. He decided because the math started leaning in a direction he could not ignore. The first push came at the county co-op on a Thursday in October. Evan was waiting on a fertilizer invoice when 2 farmers at the coffee counter started talking about a red tractor one of them had demoed on rented ground near the Kentucky line. The man talking was not a salesman type. He was the sort of farmer who distrusted adjectives. If a machine pulled well, he said it pulled well. If it burned fuel, he wrote down how much. What he said caught Evan because it was specific. He said the cab visibility was better in tobacco rows than he expected. He said the tractor held power on a wet hillside without fighting him. He said the fuel log came in lower than the comparable green machine he had been running. Evan kept his eyes on the invoice board and listened to all of it. He drove home, ate supper, and after Marcy went to bed, he opened his laptop at the kitchen table. For 3 months, he read quietly. Then he called a Case IH dealer 58 miles away instead of the closer one, because by then he was already thinking like a man who wanted no local weather around his decision. The dealer's name was Nolan Price. He was younger than Warren, but not green. He had taken over his father's store 6 years earlier, and had built a reputation for answering questions without turning every call into a closing pitch. Evan asked for specs, service coverage, parts availability, fuel estimates, and financing terms. Nolan sent the documents within 2 days. Then he called and stayed on the phone for an hour. When he did not know an answer, he said, "I don't know that yet. I'll find out." Evan noticed that. He also noticed the numbers. The red equipment was not cheap. Nothing in modern farming was cheap. But on comparable horsepower, comparable warranty, and comparable service coverage, the figures came in lower than what Evan expected to pay if he stayed with Halstead equipment. Not low enough to make the decision easy. Low enough that ignoring it felt irresponsible. So Evan took out a yellow legal pad and began building a plan that was supposed to avoid drama. The first machine to leave was a mid-size utility tractor, used mostly around tobacco. Setting plants, moving wagons, pulling the sprayer through the low fields when the ground was just dry enough to risk it. Evan sold it privately to a farmer in another county who had been looking for that exact setup. The buyer came before sunup. The tractor left before breakfast. 3 days later, a red utility tractor arrived from Nolan Price's dealership and disappeared into the south bay of the equipment shed. Evan's hired man, Nate Burrows, saw it at lunch. He stopped at the doorway and looked at the tractor for a long second. Then he said, "That yours?" Evan said, "It is now." Nate nodded once. That was the entire conversation. Over the next 19 months, Evan repeated the process until the shed looked different enough that anyone who walked inside would understand what had happened, even if no one had been invited to witness it. The main row crop tractor went next, then the older loader tractor, then the planter through a dealer 2 states over, then a combine package, then a second utility machine, then the last small green tractor that had been sitting at the back of the shed like a family photograph nobody had taken down yet. Every transaction had a reason. Every sale made sense on paper. Evan did not dump the line in anger. He unwound it carefully. That carefulness made him feel responsible. In truth, it mostly made him invisible only to himself, because Warren Halstead knew. He knew before Evan admitted it to half the people who worked for him. He knew because equipment does not vanish from a 1,000-acre farm without someone seeing it on a trailer, hearing about it from a cousin, or spotting the wrong color through an open shed door while delivering chemical totes. Warren did not call Evan. That would have made the thing too direct. He did not say, "You owe me loyalty." He did not say, "I sent mechanics to your farm when you were desperate." He did not say, "Your father bought equipment from my father, and now you are slipping out the back door." Warren was too experienced for that. But Warren had other relationships. One of them was with the agricultural loan officer at Cumberland Valley Bank, the bank that held Evan Marlowe's spring operating line. That line was the bloodstream of the farm. It paid for seed before crop money existed. It paid for fertilizer when the fields were still brown. It paid for chemicals, fuel, insurance, repairs, payroll, and all the expensive promises a farmer has to make before he knows what the sky is going to do. Evan had carried that line for 12 years. He had never missed a payment. His collateral was strong. His repayment history was clean. His financial statements showed pressure, because farming always showed pressure, but nothing that should have scared a reasonable lender. Then Warren Halstead had breakfast with the loan officer at the diner by the square. They had breakfast there every second month. It was ordinary. That was what made it powerful. Warren did not need to lie. He only had to sound concerned. He mentioned that Evan had been making major equipment changes. He said a full line shift sometimes meant a farm was trying to free cash, or cover pressure, or move debt around before anyone else noticed. He said he hoped everything was all right. But if the bank had exposure, it might be wise to look closely before spring money went out. Nothing in that sentence was an accusation. It was worse than an accusation. It was a professional suggestion from a man the lender trusted. Evan found out 3 weeks later, sitting in a gray chair across from the bank officer's desk. He had come in expecting signatures. Planting was 10 weeks away. Seed was ordered. Fertilizer was contracted. Tobacco plants were scheduled. Crop insurance had been renewed. Nate had already started winter service on the new equipment. The loan officer folded his hands and said the operating line was being placed under review. Evan did not answer immediately. He looked at the pen on the desk, then at the framed photograph of the bank's board members on the wall, then back at the man who had renewed the same line for years without theater. "What changed?" Evan asked. The officer gave him the language banks use when they do not want to say the thing that happened. Portfolio caution, market volatility, internal risk review, 30 to 45 days, nothing to be alarmed about. Evan listened until the man stopped talking. Then he said, "You had no problem with my numbers last fall." The officer smiled without comfort in it. "That's why we're reviewing, not declining." Evan drove home in silence. He parked by the machine shed and sat in the truck with the engine off. The red tractors were inside. The planter was ready. The combine had been inspected. Everything he had bought to make the farm more efficient was sitting 10 yards away from him, and none of it could plant an acre without operating money. That was when the real lesson settled on him. He had thought he was changing equipment, but in a county that small, he had also withdrawn from a relationship system. And relationship systems do not always punish a man by shouting at him. Sometimes they punish him by becoming very calm, very procedural, and very hard to argue with. Evan made calls for 4 days before he told Marcy. He called 2 farm credit offices outside the county. He called a finance broker he had met years earlier at a grower meeting. He called his crop insurance agent to ask what paperwork could move fastest if a new lender needed verification. Then he called Nolan Price. Evan explained the situation without dramatizing it. He said the bank had frozen the renewal into a review, and he needed to know if there was any way to create cash flow space through the equipment notes while he moved the operating line elsewhere. Nolan did not interrupt. When Evan finished, Nolan said, I'll call you by 4. At 3:52, he called back. He had 2 options. The first was a temporary payment deferral on 2 equipment notes, enough to loosen cash for spring inputs. The second was an introduction to an agricultural lender who worked with operations that were changing equipment lines and credit relationships at the same time. Neither option fixed the whole problem. Both options were real. Evan wrote everything down. After he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at the notes. He had expected sympathy. He had not expected movement. The call he had avoided was the one to Marcy. She was visiting her sister in Bowling Green, and Evan had waited because he wanted to have answers before he admitted there was a problem. That was not the same as being honest. Marcy came home the next afternoon. She listened to the whole story without interrupting. The co-op conversation, the dealer call, the private sales, the equipment notes, the bank review, the breakfast he now believed had started it. When he finished, she asked one question first. "Can we plant?" Evan said. "Yes, if the outside financing lands in time, and if we cut hard on everything that isn't essential." Then she asked the question that mattered more. "Why didn't you tell me it could cost us this?" Evan looked at the legal pad. Because he had not wanted to see that part of the cost. Because he had told himself the decision was operational. Because he had mistaken secrecy for control. He said, "I should have." Marcy said, "Yes, you should have." Then she poured coffee, sat down across from him, and they went through the numbers until after midnight. The alternative financing came through in late March. It was uglier than the old line. The rate was higher. The documentation was heavier. The lender wanted more reporting. The timing was tight enough that Evan lost 3 nights of sleep he could not afford to lose. But the money moved, and when the soil warmed, Evan planted. That spring became the test no spreadsheet could run for him. Nate had spent the winter learning the new machines with the seriousness of a man who understood that pride did not get crops in the ground. He sat in the cabs on cold afternoons, going through screens, settings, service intervals, and controls until the red equipment stopped feeling like a stranger. The tobacco went in during a narrow, clean window after a week of rain. The corn followed across 9 long days. The soybeans came behind without the delay Evan had feared most. The row crop tractor pulled evenly through ground that would have exposed a weak machine fast. The planter held its line. The fuel logs came in close enough to Nolan's figures that Evan stopped checking them with suspicion and started checking them as data. The machines did their job. The county did something else. At the co-op, the manager was polite, but shorter than before. At the elevator, a man who used to ask Evan about basis prices now only nodded. A neighbor who had borrowed Evan's grain cart 2 years running bought time from someone else instead. None of it was dramatic. None of it could be written into a complaint. It was just a temperature change. And after enough mornings, Evan stopped pretending he did not feel it. The shed had become a public notice board. He had posted the message without reading it himself. By harvest, the farm was still standing. The corn beat Evan's 3-year average. The soybeans came off cleaner than expected. The tobacco was strong enough to carry more of the year than he had dared hope in April. The combine ran through harvest without a failure that cost meaningful time. At the kitchen table in October, Evan added the columns the way he always did. Fuel savings, equipment payments, higher interest, extra paperwork, repair costs avoided, yield against 3-year average, cash left after the uncomfortable parts were counted. The year was not a triumph. It was not revenge. It was not proof that Warren Halstead had been wrong about everything. It did not make the bank's review harmless, or the county warmer, or the old dealership relationship easy to replace. But the number at the bottom was enough. Evan wrote one sentence beneath the totals: "Keep going." In November, Nolan Price came to the farm. Not to sell anything, not to celebrate. He came with a service truck and a checklist, because he had asked to walk every machine before winter, and Evan had finally said yes. Nolan spent 2 hours with Nate, asking field-specific questions. Which hills loaded the tractor, where the planter rode rough, how the combine handled green stems, whether the cab controls were still slowing anyone down. He found 3 minor service items and scheduled them before he left. At the end of the visit, he and Evan stood beside the shed while a cold wind moved across the empty tobacco ground. Nolan asked how the year had really gone. Evan told him. Not just the yields, not just the machines, the bank, the diner breakfast, the colder rooms, the lesson he had learned too late. Nolan listened. Then he said, "A tractor is never just a tractor around here." Evan looked toward the shed. "No," he said, "it isn't." Nolan zipped his jacket and added, "The machine has horsepower. The dealer has memory. Sometimes the memory pulls harder." That was the part Evan had missed. He had measured fuel burn, price difference, warranty terms, service radius, and resale. He had measured everything that could fit on a page, but he had not measured Warren Halstead's memory. He had not measured the lender's trust in Warren. He had not measured the way a county treats a quiet exit as a louder insult than an honest conversation. Next time, if there was a next time, Evan knew he would do it differently. He would sit across from Warren Halstead in the office with the faded equipment posters and tell him straight that the farm was changing lines. He would say why. He would give the man the respect of a direct ending instead of a slow disappearance. Maybe it would not have saved the bank line. Maybe it would not have changed the breakfast. Maybe the same machinery of pressure would have turned anyway. But Evan understood now that doing a thing quietly is not the same as doing it cleanly. The red tractors stayed in the shed. The green dealership stayed 12 miles away. The bank relationship would take years to replace, if it ever fully could. And the county would remember the color change long after Evan stopped explaining it to himself. That winter, when people asked how the new equipment had run, Evan answered simply, "It ran." That was all he gave them. The rest was written where it mattered, on the legal pad in the kitchen, under the harvest numbers and the higher interest and the service notes and the cost of learning late. Keep going. Spring would come again. Evan put the pad in the drawer, turned off the kitchen light, and went back to work.